All right. The time is 6:06. I'll call the November 3rd special Board of Education meeting for Amity to order. Mr. Caruso, you have the floor.
Well, thank you. Good evening. It's kind of like this is now the exception rather than the rule. For a while, online meetings sort of took over. This is the first online meeting I've done in a couple of months now, but I would have been just as happy to come down there, but it's so much easier for all of you to get together too. And the nice thing is if the meeting's over at 8 o'clock, we're all home at 8 o'clock instead of having to worry about getting home. So well, the idea is to talk about roles and responsibilities, but to sort of get us all in the mood, I'd like to start by everybody, luckily I can see your names, but, give me your name, how long you've been on the board, why you chose to serve on the board, and what you hope to get out of tonight. And why don't we start well, I don't know if Mr. Davis is listening or just sort of connected, but if you're on, you're my first person on the screen. I don't know if you want to jump in or if you're tied up. We'll give him a second. Hearing nothing. Donna Schuster.
Hi, Nick. Yes,
Hi.
Donna Schuster. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. I've been on the board a little over a year, and I chose to be on the board to make a difference. And I'm here to, as a new member, learn more about the roles and responsibilities of board members.
Excellent. Carol.
Hi everyone, Carol Oladele. How long? I've been on the board the same time as Donna, so a little bit over a year. July 1st was the year. And why I value education and wanted to have a voice in district policy and our education system in our town. And could you remind me of the what, Mr. Caruso?
What do you hope to get out of this evening? And I can.
About this evening. Just to sort of learn more about how boards function. We've had like onboarding meetings, but just to sort of learn more. I still feel very new.
Okay, thank you. Shannon?
Hi, Shannon Carlson. I think it's 5 or 6 years. I don't remember exactly how long. And I just think it's important, just, whether you've been on the board for a year or 10 years, it's just a nice kind of reset and refresh and reminder of our role and responsibility. And I think also there's a certain level of connectedness. I think that helps kind of bring us closer together. So thank you for providing us this evening.
You're welcome. All of a sudden the screens are all shifting around, so I hope I get people in order. Let's see. Jenny?
Hi, I'm Jenny Turner. I've been on the board just as long as Shannon. I think we're starting our 6th year, Shannon. I wanted, excuse me, sorry. I wanted to be on the board because I was interested in better coordination between the sending districts and Amity, and also in improving communication between the towns and families in Amity. What I hope to get out of tonight, I guess I'm just here to listen and see if there are cool new ideas for how we can all communicate and, as Shannon said, come together better as a community.
Very good. Let's see, Patrick.
Patrick Reed, been on the board for 3 years. The reason I got involved was because I see how important the board's role is in shaping the direction of the district going forward. Obviously not on a day-to-day basis running it, but creating a direction that improves the learning for our students. What I would like to get from tonight really is just a fuller understanding. After you've been on the board for a couple of years, there's things that people bring to your attention. Oh, I forgot about that, or just a way of providing some new perspectives on how we do things.
Never stop learning. Never. In fact, I'll learn something from you tonight, I'm sure. Let's see, Carla.
Hi, my name's Carla Eichler, and I think it's my, well, let's see, I've been on the board since 2017, and I decided to contribute to the Board of Ed because I thought it was a really relevant way for me to contribute to my community, and I'm an alumni, and my kids attend, so it was maybe something that was really meaningful to me. And I'm here because it's been a while since I've had this reminder and refresh, and I thought it would be helpful to participate.
Excellent. Let's see, Sean. I think you're still muted.
There we
you
go. I hit the wrong button. I'm sorry. Sean Hartshorn. I've been on the board just about a year. I was elected last year. Tonight I'm here to absolutely learn. Jenny, I like what you said also, to just listen, you know, and try to absorb as much as I can to be a better board member. The reason I chose the Amity board was my young kids, they're 6 and 3. I'm an alumni myself, and I loved Amity, and I just kind of want to make sure that, you know, it's only a few years away before my kids are there, and I'd like to make sure it stays the great school that it is. And if I'm on the board, hopefully I can help that along.
Thank you. Let's see, did we get Christina? I see Christina's iPhone.
Hi, yes, sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties connecting to my laptop, so I'm kind of piecing this through on my phone. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So like Sean, I'm a relatively new board member. I've been on the board for about a year, and I joined the board because I have 3 children in the school system and felt like participating in some of the conversations instead of kind of watching them happen was important. And I'm here tonight because I'm just really interested in getting a closer look at roles and responsibilities and understanding the parameters a little better.
Very good. Thank you. I don't know if Paul got back with us or if he's still tied up. So one more chance. Jennifer, you want to join our conversation a little bit? Are you?
Sure. So I'm still in my finance class too. So if everybody thinks I'm looking distracted, I'm just multitasking, which everybody says is not something you should do. But I am certainly, I've been in the district for 4 years now. And, you know, I think this is always important from my perspective, because it also reminds me where the dividing line is between board members and what my roles and responsibilities are, because what sort of, and how I can actually help you all achieve your roles and responsibilities. So I think it's always helpful to listen to these presentations and kind of get a reset and a regrounding on how collectively we all run the district.
Excellent. Thank you. Did I miss anybody? I don't think I did, but okay. So just to give you a little background, I served on the Bloomfield Board of Education from 1983 to 1993. And then in 1993, I was given the opportunity to come to work for CABE. While I was a board member, I was very active in the association and was actually first vice president, would have been president, but I had to leave my board for a different employment opportunity. And almost immediately after that, CABE offered me a lifeline because I really believe in this work. I believe what school boards do matters a lot. And to be able to help boards do, I've been doing this 29 years at the end of this month. So it's still as exciting to me as it was back then, probably more now because I actually know what I'm doing, I think. So I find this work fascinating. I love the people I get to work with because school board members by and large are they're people who are kind, looking to do good things for their community. And how can you not like working with people like that? So I have been doing this kind of workshop for quite a while. I hope you'll find some things out that are interesting. Even those of you who've been on the board a while, I find it interesting. Only one or two of you, I think, were actually on the board before COVID from the sound of it. And so I'm sure you could tell your colleagues that the world changed quite a bit in the way boards work and function since COVID started. For a while, I'd get calls from boards to say, would you like to help us do goals? And it's like, I'm not sure this is the right time to be setting long-term goals, because we're going to have a 2 or 3 year span where it's going to be hard to just keep up. But now we're out of that tunnel, I think. And I'm actually did 3 districts last week with goal setting. So that's starting to pick up a lot, because it's time to start thinking ahead. And I want to start with a real simple question for everybody. How many school board members does it take to screw in a light bulb? Can you see that slide? I just want to make sure it's showing. Okay. Ideas? Throw them out.
More than 13.
I'm assuming you have 13 altogether when you're all together.
Yes.
That would be the second best answer that one could give. All right, I'll make it
About
easy.
all of them.
All of them, that's a similar answer, tied for second best. The actual answer is none. It's up to the board to say, let there be light. You're the policymakers, you're the visionaries, you're the ones that say, we'd like to see this or we'd like to see that. And it's the superintendent's job as chief executive officer to decide, are we going to go with incandescent fluorescent candle, et cetera, and designate the appropriate person on staff to do that work. Maybe coming to you for the resources to hire that person if you don't have that person already. That's how you support your superintendent. But it's important that it's sort of like a symbiotic relationship. The superintendent's there to support you, but you're also there to support the superintendent. By the way, when I first did this presentation, or I have done this for years, but I was in one district where I had done this part of the presentation earlier, and we got further into the meeting. And while I was talking about roles, I noticed the superintendent had a legal pad out and she was just writing feverishly while we were having the meeting. And I just got curious. I said, so what are you doing? She goes, I'm taking the minutes. And of course, my first question was, do you need to take minutes for this kind of workshop other than the meeting started and the meeting ended, because there's no action? And but then one board member, I thought it was great because she literally stood up, pointed to the superintendent, said she's screwing in a light bulb, because she made the connection that the CEO shouldn't be taking the minutes. I mean, if it's an emergency and it's a special meeting or something and we didn't have time to do logistics, that's different. But that was what she always did. And we had a conversation about it because that's one of those teachable moments. It was like, if your CEO is, have any of you ever been in a meeting when somebody says who's going to take the minutes? I know when I hear that, I duck, I hide in the corner, I take a step outside for a minute. It's awful, because when you take minutes, you're only focused on what you hear and writing it down accurately, but you're not engaged. You're not participating fully. And I want my CEO participating fully in a board meeting. I want her to be the one that's ready to answer a question or to tell you what's going on or share her vision. And that doesn't happen if she's taking minutes. So they had a moment from that. And so we talked about the board's role in supporting the superintendent. And that was find some money to pay a recording secretary to come in and take the minutes, or at least record them and have them done during the day, because it was just the right thing to do. So part of your job is to support the superintendent, and part of it is to direct through policy, through your goals, through vision, and the other directives that you do through your voting. And then it is the board's responsibility to evaluate the quality of lighting. And you kind of do that together. It's not like the board gives you the superintendent a list of, we want to know all this stuff. But it's important that your regular board meetings, and actually it could be special meetings too, take time to talk about student achievement. That's why we're here. That's the work we do. And if we're not taking time in our meetings to reflect on the performance that we're doing, I don't think we're doing justice. And it's also, it's not that you're sending a negative message, but you're not sending the positive message. I suggest to boards have on every agenda report on goals. And I'm not looking for a 45-minute presentation on what we did this month, but rather it might be part of the superintendent's report. Just Item number 3 on the agenda tonight is directly related to goal 1, or in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks, we're going to give you a presentation on what's going on with special education related to what we talked about 6 months ago or a year ago, so that we're when someone in your community says, wow, the schools are great, or conversely, the schools aren't as good as they used to be, you have some data to back that up and talk about, well, actually, you know, we just got a report on the math scores and we're doing pretty darn good, especially related to the rest of our DERG or whatever. So it's important that you learn those things and have an understanding, not for micromanaging, not for, you know, minutia, but on the broader scale. Are kids learning? If we initiated a new reading program a couple years ago, are we actually doing what we thought we would do? In fact, it was in that same district. I thought it was kind of interesting. We were talking about setting goals and getting reports back. And one of the board members said, yeah, you remember that reading program we initiated 5 years ago? She was one of the long-termers, you know, 5 years ago was a long time ago. You remember that reading program? Whatever happened to that? And the superintendent said, and I get it, I guess, well, I don't really know. You know, I think the superintendent decided it wasn't working, so she stopped doing it a couple of years ago. But there needs to be that communication, and we have to have that understanding of not detail oriented necessarily, but in fact, the way I would do it is when you vote on a new initiative, have built into that, we'll be reporting annually or, you know, at a specific time to give you an idea what we expect to see and how we're doing compared to what we expected. So I think that's helpful for you as a board, but it's also helpful to the superintendent, because, you know, we're all focused on the work of the district. Sometimes we get tied up in all the, well, I'll call them the killer bees: budgets, buses, books, budgets, buildings. And it's all the stuff that you have to talk about at some point or another, but it's really subsidiary to the mission of the district, which is to teach kids. So the more time we spend at our meetings talking about teaching and learning and about achievement, the better we are, I think. So I like to remind boards why they're in it. And among the other reasons, you all talked about kids. I put 2,184 little smiley faces on the screen, and they represent what your last strategic school profile said you had in your district for children. Each and every one of those children, their entire future rests on what you do. And I don't say that flippantly or sarcastically, I truly mean it, because there's a lot of evidence that shows if a child has a successful school experience, they're much more likely to have a successful life. And conversely, if they have a terrible school experience, the odds are much greater that they won't be as successful as they might otherwise be. So a lot of responsibility on your shoulders to help these little smiley faces. And in fact, in your district, I'd go a step further. And if you add the 3 elementary districts who are all feeding your high school, all of these children are going to depend on you doing your job effectively, because each and every one of those elementary children, I'm sure you're anticipating 99% of them, 90% of them are going to make it to the high school, the middle school and the high school. So you are responsible for all of them. And I should have probably done a total of all 4 together. I forgot. But again, think about this when you're talking about children. Another way to look at it, if you get a report that says 80% of our kids did really good on this, well, that's still 20% is 400 kids that maybe we could do something better for, something more for. So we never want to lose sight of the 10%, the 20%, because they're real children and they're real numbers. And so never let up on what you're doing for the kids. It's really, really critical. The book School Board Leadership in America was written in 1958, I believe. Ed Tuttle was the first executive director of the National School Boards Association way back then. And I heard about this book from somewhere recently, maybe a year or 2 ago, and I found it on Amazon used for $3. So I couldn't pass up the opportunity to get it and read it. And what I found really, well, 2 things. One, the things he wrote about in 1958, and I think this was the updated version from 1960, many of those issues we're still talking about. We're talking about good instruction, good teaching and learning, how do we find the right resources? It's fascinating how much has not changed in education over the years. We could also make the argument that a lot has, and the book stress, you could see some of the differences, but it was just surprising how much the conversation has not changed over the years. But within the book also, there were a bunch of quotations, and I love the one that's on the screen here. I read, I study, I examine, I listen, I reflect. And out of all this, I try to form an idea into which I put as much common sense as I can. We can bury ourselves in data. I mentioned before, you want to hear results, you want to hear what's going on, but we don't want to get blinded by all the numbers. And at some point, we have to start making decisions. In fact, I don't know if you've ever heard of Simon Sinek. Simon is a speaker. He has a TED Talk that's actually about 10 years old, and it's still one of the top 20, I believe, on the TED Talks, because he talks about how successful organizations sort of function. And he talks about how they exist for the why. What's our purpose? Why do we exist, rather than what we do? And it's about a 17-minute video. Type in Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K, and it's a really fascinating look at how to look at successful organizations. And I see sometimes when we're dealing with that specifically, or like talking about goals, I'll show that video first, and then we can talk about what your why might be. And it's an interesting exercise. But one of the other things Simon talks about in that is brain development and how people make decisions. And he mentions that the part of the brain that analyzes data is different and separate and distinct from the part of the brain that makes decisions. And they don't talk to each other. Those two spheres don't talk to each other real well. And so it's sometimes a stretch for some people who maybe need more data. I was kind of the touchy-feely guy on my board. That'd be 5 minutes into the presentation, I'm ready to vote. I love it. Or I'm not sure I can support it. And everyone else is like, but we haven't heard enough yet. I need more data. It's like, what do you mean? It's clear as a day, So we all process data differently, and we have to have patience with each other. But the idea that I love is the idea about making sure there's common sense. It's one of the reasons that I'm really happy that the people that have done our policy work, Vin Mastero was our policy person for 25 years, just retired. We're bringing another person on starting next month, and I really can't give his name yet, but he's also a retired superintendent. It's going to be phenomenal. But the reason we're not just comfortable, but we like the way we help you with policy is they're in the trenches. They look at a policy not just from does it meet the legal aspect, and they also go through our legal department, but they also look at it from a former superintendent's perspective. If I had this policy in front of me, can I make it work? Would it help me as a superintendent do what I need to do, or as a principal or whatever? So that common sense part really plays into that. So again, these are just a couple random thoughts to get you to think about things. Now, this is where the presentation might fall apart for a second, because I'm switching presentations and I don't know if it's going to shift the focus on the screen share. So if it doesn't, I'll unshare and then reshare in a second. So now, do you see something on this screen that says Constitution of the State of Connecticut? Okay, so I'm going to unshare. And then I'm going to reshare. I think that's this one. Let's try it. Now you should see something that's okay. Very good. So when I started working with boards, I grabbed the state of Connecticut prints a book every couple of years called Connecticut Education Laws, and the State Department publishes it, and it's every law in Connecticut that affects public schools, and it has some sort of community laws. It has the Freedom of Information Act in it, but the bulk of it is really about what school districts do, and it's all the laws, and that of course is added to every couple of years or every year, because the legislature can't go a session without adding more laws. But in general, there's a few that I found are really, really important for board members, not just to know and understand, but it also helps clarify those questions you've had about what is our role, what's the superintendent's role. So this is a way of sharing some of those thoughts. And I will tell you, many of these I didn't know when I was a board member. In fact, when I was a board chair, I didn't know these things. And I really wished I had. It would have made me a better chair, and it would have helped our district a lot. So I'm hoping that even those of you who've been on the board for a while will find some nuggets in here that will make your life a little easier. And I'm going to start with the state constitution. And I hate to read slides. We call it death by PowerPoint, but because they're laws and because they're the words matter. I am going to read them just to make sure everybody, well, I've also noted some people, if you're on the phone, for example, you probably can't read it very easily. So just to make it easy for everyone. But the Constitution says there shall always be free public elementary and secondary schools in the state. The General Assembly shall implement this principle by appropriate legislation. Now, when you look at that language, or you listen to that language, does anything stand out in anybody's mind? Something that you might give pause to think about for a minute? This is where doing online is a little harder, but. Well, I'll just jump in then, and it starts with, it's the state constitution. The state of Connecticut, in fact, every state has responsibility for public schools in their state. The federal constitution, when it was being drafted, I mean, many of the framers of the Constitution, I know John Adams and Thomas Jefferson wrote extensively about the importance of education. They got it. And we could argue that their vision of what universal education was very different than what we look at it now. Jefferson said that the purpose of public education was, or the purpose of education was to separate the genius from the rubbish, with the idea that you could give high quality education to 10% of the community, and those are the owners and factory owners and field owners and all that. The quote unquote leaders could get a really great education. The rest could work in a factory or on a farm or whatever. So their perception didn't include women, people of color. There was a whole lot of things that they thought universal education didn't need. So we're in a different time, but the concept is similar. But they all believed that was a function of the state. They did not believe it was a federal responsibility, although they certainly try to influence what you do by the purse strings. They'll throw grants out there and you only get the money if you do what they want. But in general, it's a state obligation to provide schools. And notice that obligation goes to the General Assembly. It isn't to school boards directly constitutionally. The Connecticut General Assembly is responsible for providing free public schools. Now, they didn't want that. So they came up, and Connecticut Statute 10220 is actually several pages long. This is just the first paragraph, and I think it's a very important paragraph for us to know. It starts, each local or regional board of education shall maintain good public elementary and secondary schools, implement the educational interests of the state as defined in section 104A. We'll go over that in a second, and provide such other educational activities as in its judgment will best serve the interests of the school district. Now, I had what I call an epiphanic moment, an epiphany, when I read this, because, and again, having been on a board where we were not always in great relationships with our town council, who was always trying to tell us what to do. And I found the statute to be really helpful. And in working with boards, I found, first of all, doesn't matter why you ran for the Board of Education. I mean, I hope you did it for all the right reasons, but in the eyes of the state of Connecticut, your primary function is to maintain good public elementary and secondary schools. Now, you can disagree on what good means. And in fact, boards spend a lot of time disagreeing on what good means. And the legislature tries to clarify what good means in a subsequent legislation, some of which I'll share with you. So you are driven by a bunch of laws. You think you're on a Board of Ed, you can do whatever you want, or have quite a bit of latitude. In some places, maybe yes, but in other places, you really don't have authority beyond what you're given. So maintaining good public elementary, secondary schools, implementing the educational interest of the state. You are a state agency. You may be elected locally, and on a regional board, it's even different because you're elected as a region. Now, I'm not sure in your communities, are you elected in your own towns and then come to the board as a representative? Okay, I'm seeing nodding heads. Some, it's the whole region, all votes for everybody, but that gives you more connection to your community for sure, if you're elected within your own town. But when you're at a board meeting, your responsibility is first and foremost to the educational interests of the state. Now, you may have noticed just yesterday and today, the press was talking about a community in the northeast corner of the state where there's been complaints that they refuse to have a mental health clinic in their high school, and the parents in the community requested a hearing of the State Board of Ed, and they have found that the investigation found that there's fault and that they're going to have to do something about that. And what they do, I guess they're going to have a hearing and they'll go through and render some sort of decision, but they have the authority to do that. You're close enough to Bridgeport to know what happened with them a number of years ago, where the state actually said this board is not serving implementing the educational interests of the state. So we are actually going to remove the Board of Education and we're going to place or name a different board, which was interesting because some of the people didn't even live in Bridgeport, but they were serving as a Board of Education. That's happened only a couple of times. It was Bridgeport and Hartford was the other one a number of years ago, probably 20 years ago. The Hartford Board of Ed was dissolved and there was a Board of Education appointed to replace them for 2 years, I believe it was, or until the state board decided, in fact, that, okay, they've got their act together, we can give it back. But they also have different intercessions. They can appoint a receiver or a special master, someone who actually makes all the decisions of the district. They don't necessarily dissolve the Board of Ed, but you have no authority anymore. In fact, in one district, the first thing the receiver did was put the superintendent on leave of absence and took over basically completely. The board didn't meet except for training for 2 years. And we were in there every month for training for 2 years to get them ready when they took back over. And that was a very interesting situation there. And that was a elementary district that had to send their kids to a separate high school. And so there's some relationships between, like, you're sending towns and what they were going through. So you implement the educational interests of the state. And that's one of the arguments. Some of you who've lived through the beginning of COVID, remember when the governor had an executive order to require masks in schools, and parents were coming to school board meetings and saying, you don't have to listen to that, just vote to, remove masks, and you can do that, and please do that. Well, you couldn't, because part of the implementing that educational interest is adhering to all laws, and that had the weight of law. So it was a simple response, but not necessarily a simple one for people to accept. And it caused a lot of angst in a lot of communities, but you are charged first and foremost. In fact, that's one of your superintendent's primary responsibilities, is making sure everything we do is legal, working with the board attorney where necessary. And again, referring to policy, which also should have, as it's written, is compared to law to make sure they're consistent. So that's part of what you have to do. And then finally, and this is the language that can be very helpful to you when your communities are trying to, I'll use the word interfere with the work you're doing, is provide such other educational activities as in your judgment will best serve the interests of the school district. And again, because your relationship with your municipal bodies is slightly different than it might be, like in our town council decided what our budget was. We had to fight for it every year, and they could tell us what we would spend. You raise your own budget, if I'm not mistaken, right? The 3 towns vote on it, but it's your budget. So that you have a little more autonomy there, which it can be very helpful. I just heard this quote recently, and it really made a lot of sense to me. The Board of Education member is a state official functioning at a local level. If that helps put it in perspective a little bit more. You obviously have to respond to community members when they address you, but your role is not to function at the local level to solve their problems. It would be to direct them to the appropriate person to help them solve their problem. Your authority as a board only is legal during a regular or during a called meeting of the board, publicly noticed meeting, while you are in session. The decisions you make as a unit have the weight of law and have authority, but individually, none of you have that authority to really do anything. The chair has a little bit more authority in that you give them, you request of them that they chair the meetings, that they sometimes sign papers. One thing I learned the hard way is the board chair is the one that gets served with papers when the school board's getting sued. And I found that out one early morning when the sheriff showed up at my door with papers and served me. And of course I freaked out because what am I supposed to do? So I called the superintendent. He says, already got it. We got a copy too. We're going to meet with the attorney this afternoon. Don't worry about it. It's all good. And we will talk a little more about your liability a little bit further into this, because I'm sure you want to know what's safe for you to do. But I mentioned the educational interests of the state. I just want to kind of quickly go over the 4 that are listed. But the language, as you can see here, says shall include but not be limited to, which means they can pretty much do whatever they want, and sometimes do. But the 4 that are really drafted and codified are, well, make it easy on this one. The 2 words that are most important in this are equal opportunity. You have to provide equal opportunity for children to receive suitable programs of educational experiences, which means that children that have any kind of deficit or might be exceptional in some other way have the opportunities available to them to be successful. And the state has over the years broadened that to include equity. I know I serve on the Commission for Educational Technology, and we had to be talking about equity in terms of accessibility to internet and also to devices, even as simple as that. So that became part of the educational interests of the state. And of course, the legislature and the governor and some private enterprises, some philanthropic organizations all kicked in to try to help make that happen. But equal opportunity it's mirrored in federal law with special education, handicapped accessibility. There's a lot of places where you may have to make decisions that create equity where it might not exist. You have 2 middle schools, if I'm not mistaken. You would have to ensure that a child in either one of those buildings has a similar experience. And if one does a whole lot better than the other, then you'd be working to bring one up to meet the other's level. And you can't have one school that gets everything and the other that can't. That's all part of the state's interpretation of that law. To talk about the minimum budget requirement is probably really important for you to understand because you're on the firing line every year at budget time. Everybody expects you to do everything you need to do for no cost, and that obviously doesn't work. So we're going to talk for a minute about how the funding structure in Connecticut is broken so that you won't necessarily have to feel guilty anymore when you bring together a budget that your community is upset with because it seems like it's too much. I was actually a board member in 1985 when Connecticut legislature passed the Education Enhancement Act. You may have heard about that in ancient history. You're all too new to have had to live through that. But back in 85, a startling statistic that was used to sort of rationalize this Education Act was that something like half the teachers coming into the teaching field at that time were coming in from the bottom third of graduating classes in college. That we were paying teachers so poorly in Connecticut that we weren't attracting the best and the brightest necessarily to aspire to be educators. And so one of the ways the legislature decided to make that easier, to make teaching accessible to more people, was to say, you can reopen your contract negotiations, you can pay teachers a whole lot more money, and we'll pay the difference. So we're going to come up, they made a commitment to fund 50% of education spending in Connecticut. And that's an average. You might get less than New Haven, for example, but the pot would be 50% of what was being spent in Connecticut. Here's where the first kicker is, because they've never funded 50% in the almost 30 years now, 20 something years. They have never, ever paid 50% of education. Even the year they implemented the bill, they didn't. And so when you hear about the formula, the education cost sharing formula, and they say the formula is broken, the formula is not broken. It is just underfunded. For a formula to work, you have to take what you need, what you get, and divide it equitably back to equal access to make it work. But when they didn't fund it adequately, that meant some people were getting actually meant everybody was getting shortchanged. But when there's less to go around, the division between those that needed it most and those that still needed it, but maybe not as challenged a district, the divide got wider and wider. And so the challenge to boards was, we really need X amount to run our schools. We can't depend on the state to kick in their share, but we're still obligated. We are required to implement the educational interests of the state. And again, there's a lot of expectations. We'll talk about mandates in a second as part of that, but there's all these things that are expected of you. In fact, more and more and more every year, with no additional resources. The best they've done with MER is you can't spend less than last year. That's not helpful because everything, especially right now, inflation's at a rate where the same as last year is going to mean a real deficit for you next year. So that was part one. They have not funded the districts. In fact, in Connecticut, the number's typically in the 30s. I'm not sure where it is exactly right now. There's been an infusion of federal money, which has helped the state look good the last couple of years. But in terms of the state commitment, that really hasn't changed in years. Here's the other part that makes it difficult. Federal government, maybe 25, 30 years ago, made a decision that they were going to codify special education laws, that they wanted to protect the children that needed help the most. So they came up with a law, the laws about special education that one sort of helped you identify the children that needed help the most. They articulated in the law basically, or through regulations, which children needed the help the most. And then a legal process to provide due process for those people who did not feel they were getting served adequately. Sounded great on paper. It would have probably worked pretty well if the federal government had come up with the 40% they committed to making this work. The commitment from the federal government was 40% of special education costs would be met by federal expenditures. That one never got, I think maybe right now nationally it's maybe 10, 13%. I think in Connecticut it's less than 10%. For years it was 5%. It's only, again, because of that infusion of federal money the last couple of years, it's gone, it may have doubled to 10% or 13%. But Connecticut was typically 5% of your costs were met through support from the state of Connecticut. And nationally, it was only about 7.5%. So they never supported it on that end. And when the laws were written, far fewer children were identified. The costs were significantly less, and nobody anticipated the legal costs that were going to happen, because buried in that law, this tiny little clause said that if the parent prevails on any part of their complaint, you pay all their legal costs. And this is not meant as a dig, it's not, but there are some law firms out there that are real experts on special education law, and they are going to win on something every time. And the clock's ticking while they're working. And again, not as a negative reflection, they're there to help parents with due process. The problem isn't the process as much as the fact that all those extra expenditures were never anticipated and never accommodated through federal law. What that again means is big rock, big hard place, Board of Education right in the middle, because you have to, those things are not even debatable. You can't say, we can maybe do a little less in math instruction or do a little less here. And you have all found ways to cut over the years. And this year, I suspect, will be no different. But you can't do that with special ed. You might find ways of bringing some children into the district if you can bring enough together with the same situation so that you can have hire a professional and it costs less than outplacement. But ultimately, you are bound by whatever the process determines is the need. And it's tough. So the reason for this long-winded explanation about financing is it's one of the places where the biggest bone of contention with your communities is going to be. And the biggest issues facing the board starting in a couple of months is going to be budget and funding and finance. And to at least be able to walk in and say, I now feel better that I'm presenting, maybe it's a 3, 4, or 5% increased budget, maybe it's 10%. I actually remember a day when you could do that 10% budget increase, but it didn't happen very often. But the idea that, yes, we have an issue with needing more than than the community may even be able to support. We don't, sometimes it's not willingness to pay, it's ability to pay. One you can control or influence, the other is kind of difficult. But the idea that when you approach your community, it should be from a position without apologizing. It shouldn't be, we're really sorry, we'd like to do less, but we're stuck. We are presenting the budget that we have to present. We understand that not everybody's kicking in their fair share, but this is the need, and we shouldn't need to apologize because there isn't enough. It's because it's not your fault. And I hope if one thing you come away with tonight is that you can repeat that to yourself next February when things get a little dicey. It's not our fault, because it really isn't. And I've seen way too many boards struggle year after year because they feel like if we did a better job, we could get less, we could spend less. And it's really not about that at all. It's not a spending problem. It's a resource problem. So move on to something a little different. This started with Chef versus O'Neill, which was a lawsuit that engaged Hartford only, but the legislature understood that this, and I can make this available. So I see you taking a picture of the screen. I'll email this out later and make sure that it's distributed to everybody. So you don't have to worry about taking pictures. But after Chef, the legislature understood this is an area that's going to affect other communities. And so they came up with, are you raising your hand for us, Jennifer? Or is that, oh, your other, okay. Never mind. So they anticipated that it was going to be elsewhere. And so they added language to the interests of the state that children, your students have to have opportunities to work, interact with teachers from other racial, ethnic, and economic backgrounds. That it's important for children to learn from people that may look differently, have a different background, different culture, even socioeconomically. They made sure that was included. But the state feels that that is in the interest of everyone to do that. And so you are required to provide different kinds of services. I suspect your proximity to New Haven may need some interactive work with the New Haven Public Schools, for example. A town like Killingly, which is way up in the middle of nowhere, might have a difficulty with that. So they might have to come up with a different kind of program or interaction, but everybody's required to do that. And then finally, I mentioned mandates a minute ago. It's actually in the state law that you must adhere to mandates. You know, if you thought it was kind of like loosey-goosey and maybe it was optional, it's not. And mandates cover many different kinds of things. It involves, for instance, something that sounds simple, but you have to have professional development. And every year legislators decide, we think you need to have professional development here or here. In fact, yesterday, a committee I chair, the Digital Learning Advisory Council for the Commission for Educational Technology, we were talking about when COVID hit, teachers were panicking because they weren't being helped with online instruction. And it was not native for anybody. This was something they were struggling to figure out. And we actually tried as a commission to influence the legislature to say, could you give us some relief for a couple of years on all this mandated professional development, you know, bloodborne pathogens, CPR, some of it very valuable. Is it valuable every year? Could we do some of these things every 3 or 4 years, or even do it once and maybe a refresher periodically? But a lot of these things are mandated annually. And, you know, some constituent met a legislator said, this really should be mandated. The legislator says, let's do it. And it gets sometimes shoved in the implementer bill so they don't even debate it. And there's another mandate. And so, and the word they left out, by the way, is unfunded, because they don't fund these things. And so every time there's another mandate, you have to take from what the limited resources you have and divide it out a little bit more. And in terms of PD, I'd say it's even more than just about money. It's about time, because you have only so many hours that you can find time to give professional development to your teachers and to your certified staff. And if you are dividing that up, in fact, if you add up all the mandated PD that has nothing to do with math instruction, writing, all those things that you want to have your teachers learn, there's no time to do it. And so it's a challenge every year, but that's an example of a mandate that has an extreme impact on school districts in a negative way, I think. I'm editorializing a bit, and I apologize for that. But another example, a few years ago, there was a statistic that in high schools around the state, there was a disproportionate number of expulsions per capita in a couple of communities versus the rest of the state. So, you know, there's an average, maybe it's 5 for 10,000 or 5 per 1,000. I don't know what the actual number is, but in these 2 or 3 communities, it might've been 20 or 30 per 1,000. I mean, it was significantly higher. And the legislators said, this is unconscionable. Somebody's doing something wrong. Instead of trying to get to the root of the problem, they just said, you can't expel kids anymore, except for some very specific reasons. And the expectation was, we will do this in school. There'll be in-school suspension. There'll be a variety of things that we will do for kids in school. They might still have to be sequestered in some way. So that meant additional teachers, additional resources, space, could be anything. I was working with the New Britain board at the time when this happened, and they said it cost us $1.2 million that we had not budgeted for to implement this, because they had 2 or 3 high schools, large high schools. I don't remember how many middle schools, but it impacted them as well. Significant problems. I mean, they have a much bigger budget than yours, but still nobody has $1 million sitting around in a slush fund waiting for it to go. Everybody budgets tightly. So they were struggling with it. And so our legislative tactic every year is to try to get them as much information ahead of time. Say, do you realize if you pass this bill, this is what's going to happen? And sometimes it works, often it doesn't. And it's just a constant battle. And that's why we look to you in your local districts where possible to get involved with your local legislators. We have a government relations committee. In fact, we also have a state and federal relations committees, which deal with both state as obvious and federal laws. Our federal group goes down to Washington every year and lobbies our federal legislators. One of your former board members, Sheila McCrevin, was very actively involved in our legislative activities way back when. In fact, I think I went with her to Washington a couple of times when we were both board members a long time ago. So it's important, though, to understand that these are not optional. And this is, again, one of the dilemmas that you run into. I mentioned about good and how we can interpret good in a lot of ways. Some of the ways the legislature has looked to sort of enunciate what good means is by providing a whole bunch of statutes that require you to do things like you have to provide adequate books, supplies, materials, equipment, staffing, facilities, technology, equitably allocate them amongst your schools. They put that right in there as well, and to provide a safe school setting. And these are just examples. There's a whole 450-page book full of things like this. They don't trust you to make wise decisions, I guess. And in fact, this slide here talks about the strategy for giving you the authority to make many of these decisions. When we're confronted with new mandates, what we often do is to say, look, instead of making it a mandate, require a policy. And that way you can draft a policy in your district that's going to best affect your communities. How can we use our policy in a way that meets the expectation of the law, but in a way that doesn't harm us? And we're often very successful with that. As many mandates as there are, it could have been a lot worse if we didn't get some of this language changed. And as you look at the list, there's some really heavy issues that they deal with when these things come up: discipline, homework, attendance, drugs, alcohol, youth suicide. It's often when there's a tragedy in the state, the legislature immediately tries to fix it through legislation. And that's when we have to go in and kind of say, look, we agree with you that it's something that needs to be addressed, but let the local districts work on policy. And of course, as CABE members, you get samples of those as our policy department. When the legislature is done with their work, our policy department goes into high gear. They review every piece of legislation, and then they draft samples of every policy that would be affected by that legislation. So they're very busy, and they have to do it quickly because you need it by June 1st or whatever for your help. So they go crazy trying to make it all happen, or by the end of the month anyway. Reporting of bus complaints, by the way, is not call your local school board member and ask them to fix it for you. There are processes and procedures for things like that. All of parents who have issues or staff members who have issues have people to go to within the district. And it's not the board member. They might come to you for help, and your job is to help give them direction to see who would the best person be for you to talk to. And that might be the superintendent. I suspect because of the way the structure is set up, it might be, well, it's going to be middle school or high school. If it's an elementary, would refer them back to the elementary board, in most cases at least. But even there, it's probably go back to the teacher to start with, or discuss this with the principal. And often when they say, I tried to talk to the principal, they wouldn't talk to me. And as a board member, if I thought the process wasn't being adhered to, I'd be concerned. I think it's important that we know that someone is going to be handled properly. But the answer, what they're really telling you usually is, well, yeah, they did actually make a decision. I just don't like it. Now, one is a board concern. If somebody's not doing their job, that's one thing. But if somebody makes a decision, it's not our job to second guess that decision. There should be a process in place. If a principal made a decision, they can appeal it to the superintendent. Most boards have a process very rarely used where they might, if they're not happy with the superintendent's decision, appeal it formally to the Board of Education and actually have a hearing. Now, that's different than picking up the phone and say, can you make this go away? I am formally presenting my complaint to the school board. The expectation here is that you would render a decision based only on evidence presented in that hearing. I'm going to repeat that because it's really important. Only on evidence presented at the hearing. The reason that's important is, let's say this led up to parents unhappy, teacher did something wrong. It leads to a termination. That's probably a worst case scenario, or an expulsion. Those are the two worst case scenarios. If you walk into a termination hearing, for example, and I'll actually give you an example of this in a second, go into a hearing, and when you walk in and you see the teacher that's being terminated, and it's either somebody you've had run-ins with as a parent, or maybe it's a good friend. I mean, it could be a positive relationship, but you walk in and say, I can't fairly judge this person. I either have an axe to grind with them. The kid, maybe if it's an expulsion, I caught the kid setting my garbage cans on fire last June, and I'm not going to be able to rationally deal with this child based only on evidence. You recuse yourself. It's very important to do that, because I'll give you the example. We had a grievance hearing. Teacher grieved her evaluation. Now, according to our contract, I suspect the same as yours, a teacher's evaluation is not grievable. It is there. And so it should have been a 5-minute meeting. You know, I'm unhappy with my evaluation. Sorry, it's not grievable under the contract. Have a good night. That's really how the meeting should have gone. We didn't even bring our attorney in that night, because who would have thought there'd be a problem? So what happened was, the attorney that represented the teacher addressed the board, and instead of saying my charge here is to show that the teacher was unfairly treated in an evaluation, he pointed to one of the board members and goes, Mr. Smith, isn't it true that you were in the supermarket last month and you talked to so-and-so and said, this is the worst teacher your child ever had? What do you mean? How did you hear that? Doesn't matter how I heard it. Is it true? And he goes, well, yeah. How did you hear that? So at this point, we had to recess the meeting. We had to call our attorney, because now we've given that teacher grounds to appeal on the charge that the board member was not impartial going into that hearing. He had publicly stated something negative about that teacher. Our attorney, fortunately, and this is 7 o'clock at night, she was home. It took a half hour to come in. She worked for Shipman and Goodwin back then, and this was almost 40 years ago, 35 years ago. So they were only getting $350 an hour back then at straight time. And of course, that was a lot more money back then. We had to pay for her to drive in about a half hour away, and we had a 5-hour hearing, because we had to make sure that every I was dotted, every T was crossed, and that nobody could claim we were unfair. At the end of 5 hours, we had the same exact decision, because ultimately in a grievance, it's whether the contract was violated or not. That is the only question that comes up. And the answer was, it was not violated. But in order to protect, we had to spend all that money. Now, if we took it a step further, if that teacher was being terminated, which is a far more serious, it has much more challenging rules of evidence, et cetera, et cetera. You're terminating an employee. If that happened in a termination hearing, the likelihood is that person could end up with their job no matter what they did, because any attempt to remove them from the job, unless you have a really well-documented case, you're going to have an attack of its retribution, because this board member had something against our teacher. So for 2 reasons, this is all important. Understand the chain of commands there for really important reasons. And secondly, you don't want to be the one held liable if you overstep your bounds and the district gets sued. Now, we are going to talk a little bit about where your culpability or liability might harm you or not in a couple minutes. But in general, you harm the system if you are out there getting involved at the wrong level. You want to make sure that you are directing people to get help, but that you're not trying to solve their problem for them. That end run, and if it's a staff member, I'm going to say this boldly, it's not universal, but I bet it's 95%. If a teacher is approaching a member of the Board of Education, rather than going through their due process, it's because they believe they're wrong and they know if you go through process, they're going to lose. And they want you to go around the superintendent's back and make it go away without going through due process. And you can't fall into that trap. Now, a couple of you are alumni, so you probably know some of the teachers or administrators still, potentially. I went to school here in Bloomfield, so I knew many of the teachers that were still teachers or administrators that were my teachers. And a couple of them took advantage of me the first couple of times. Hey, it's so nice to see you on the Board of Ed. You really should be aware of something. It wasn't even like they were asking, like, could you do this for me? It was, you need to be aware of something. And what I found out the hard way was sometimes they were trying to get me to go off and fight a battle that I had no business fighting, and that they should have had their union support them in that. Your job is not to go around the chain of command, especially if it's labor related. I really encourage you to go back to your union rep and talk to them about it, because if it does come to the board, I am not going to be able to sit fairly on this. I'm going to have to recuse myself if you get me involved in it here. It's just not worth it. You want me on the board where I can be impartial, but if you drag me into it now, I'm not going to be able to do that. So that's kind of, and I hope this is all helping. It's hard when we're on remote. In fact, there's several blank screens. So just trying to get a reaction from people sometimes different. I do see nodding heads and stuff, but I want to make sure this is all relevant and that you find it will be helpful. Superintendents, we should talk a little bit about the statute that gives you the authority, actually the obligation to hire a superintendent in schools. You must hire a superintendent. The superintendent by law is the chief executive officer. The CEO of the district has executive authority over the school system and responsibility for its supervision. The superintendent of schools is your only employee. Everybody else is an employee of the superintendent. Now, depending on the process, some districts, the board may still vote to approve at a level like maybe a principal, maybe an assistant superintendent or business manager. Not always. You're not required to. You're not obligated to. Personally, I think boards, if you have any involvement in hiring a principal, it should only be the superintendent brings you a candidate, you interview them and say, yep, okay, or you better go back, but not to, my board actually was given a choice of 3. And we picked the absolute worst of the 3 and had all kinds of problems after that, because we had one that was superb, who would have been ideal if he was a high school principal. Unfortunately, it was an elementary school we were hiring for. So as much as we liked him, he didn't have the elementary experience we liked. Second candidate had incredible elementary experience, and he was actually my first choice. Also, this being 1984, he was very into using technology for education, and that was like real cutting edge back then. You had to know how to spell DOS back then to really understand anything. And then the third candidate wrote grants in our district for 15 years. I think she may have been a part-time social studies coordinator, but she had never been in front of a classroom. And I cannot, I mean, maybe there are some really successful principals who have never been a classroom teacher. I don't personally know how that would happen. Guess who we hired? You can probably guess. She'd been in fact, the superintendent was adamant. He goes, the only reason she's here tonight is because she's been in the district 15 years and I owed her the chance to interview for the job, comma, but she is not my first choice. He couldn't have made it more obvious to us that one of the other 2 candidates should have been the person. For the next 2 years, and she lasted 2 years, I'll give her credit, we had problem after problem after problem after problem in that school. And we would go to the superintendent, who was our employee, and say, what's going on in that school? And he would say, not my fault. You hired her. I didn't. Now, I still would have an issue with the CEO wasn't dealing with it and coming back to the board, but it's really hard to argue with that. So in terms of hiring, I think it's really the superintendent's job. It's your obligation to give the superintendent the best support team she can have. Now, there are levels where I think she has to make you comfortable with those decisions, because they are also implementing your policies, implementing your directives, but CEO is CEO. The boards let there be light. We're at the 30,000 foot level, whatever, however you want to look at that. It's not our job to manage the district. It is to lead the district. And the superintendent, well, frankly, I'd say the superintendent has to have a careful balance of leadership and management. But I always look for leader more than manager, because I think that's way more important. The only other part of the statute about superintendents that I think is really important is that you must evaluate annually. The process is mutually determined and agreed upon. That's important language. I've known some boards that often when they start to get unhappy, say, well, we're going to change the evaluation because we're not happy with the way it works. You cannot do that unilaterally. You would have to say to the superintendent, we would like to sort of re-examine the process. Can we meet and discuss this together? But it has to be mutually determined and agreed upon. I'd also say at this point, the purpose of evaluation is not a checklist to see how many demerits you get before you fail. It's to the purpose is to what do you need, or what do we all have to do to make the schools better? It's to help us improve. And there are times, I mean, we do have to be the employer, and sometimes evaluation can be tough, but it's always with the purpose of helping us all be better. And I like to sort of stress that when I work with boards, that because there are some board members that will, and I mean, I've seen some teachers that treat children like that. Everybody starts the class with an A, and every time you do something wrong, your grade's going to go down. And at the end of the year, the last people standing get the B's or C's. In those, but it seems almost like a mission of some teachers, or it used to be, to fail as many kids as they can to prove how tough they were. Not good, not good. So let's see. Oh, yes. And it's the superintendent's responsibility to make sure everybody else gets evaluated. Not that she will do all of that herself. Her principals will, content, curriculum coordinators may do part of that. There'll be a lot of different ways of people being evaluated. She makes sure the system's working effectively, and you should be able to explain to you how it works. I think it's important for board members to kind of have a basic sense of how evaluation works. What happens if we have a teacher who's inexperienced? What kind of extra reinforcement do we do the first 2 or 3 years or 5 years? If we have a teacher who shows that they're maybe lacking in certain areas, do we put them on an intensive program, or do we give them a couple years off without a lot of classroom observations, knowing that they're doing pretty good, and focus our attention on the more needy teachers? Just not to know Mrs. Smith is excellent, Mrs. Jones isn't. That's not, you don't want to know that. You shouldn't know that information, but that we know there's a process in place to do that. And so when we hear at the end of the year, so many teachers are rated excellent, we have a small core group of people that we're doing extra intensive work with, et cetera, you'll have a better understanding of how that relates. So that's kind of important for you to know. This is my favorite statute, and we're almost done. There's only a couple more. And the first time I saw this, it really, well, I'll read it and I'll ask if anybody sees anything interesting about it. Each local board of education shall prepare an itemized estimate of the cost of maintenance of public schools for the ensuing year, and shall submit such estimate to the Board of Finance. Now, I know with you, it might be a little different because of the way your funding structure works. The money appropriated by any municipality for the maintenance of public schools shall be expended by and in the discretion of the Board of Education. So there's other than, well, let me just say, other than in the title, there's one word missing from this statute. Make it a little easier for you. The word budget. They do not call it a budget. They call it an itemized estimate. I think that was done deliberately, and it's very important language, because I know in my mind still, even after years of working with school boards and budgets, when I think of the word budget, we have a column of what we're going to spend, we have a column of what we spent, and there better not be any zeros. Or there better be all zeros in that third column, because if we budgeted well, if we are good budgeters, we spent exactly what we said we were going to spend. That doesn't work in school boards. It doesn't work in most businesses, but in school districts particularly, it does not work. And so we're setting ourselves up for failure when even on the document we give to our community members, we say budget, because your finance boards, your community members see budget and they're saying, okay, you don't do a very good job of budgeting. I'm looking at last year and you didn't spend money anywhere near where you said you were going to do it. It's an itemized estimate. I think you need to help explain that to folks in your communities and put it on the document or call it a spending plan. Use any terminology other than budget, because it's semantics, but I think it's really important. The mindset is really important. I'd also say for yourselves that if you look at it as an estimate, we become less buried in our own agendas when it comes time to budget. I want this program. I want this program. And we're fighting sometimes for the same resources. It's an estimate. It's possible that we could fight tooth and nail over something. I might even win, but then a month from now, in fact, I was in a district last week. They need $500,000 for a new boiler. And they don't have it's a one school, 240 kid district. They don't have money to buy a boiler. And so now they're struggling, and that budget is going to go out the window. And even with COVID, those of you who were on the board as COVID hit, how many things did you plan on spending that you didn't? You know, and sometimes it's transportation or substitute teachers, all these things, they're in that estimate. And we are anticipating, it's our best judgment where we plan on spending the money. It goes to heck the first day. If you could spend it all on July 1st, you might do pretty darn good, but by July 2nd, all bets are off. The family that moves in with a child with exceptional needs, or a boiler dies, or I know one district, it was just snow on the roof. They called up an emergency. The roof was starting to creak. They were afraid the roof was going to collapse because they had 3 feet of snow on it. The superintendent called somebody. They came out, they cleared the roof that day, and then hit them with a bill for over $1 million. Emergency, had no choice, but boom, estimate. So our board once, we argued about what size snowblower we should buy. Should we buy 5 horse or 7 horse? And everybody knows they should be at least 10 horse. But we got into the minutia rather than thinking globally, thinking at that let there be light level, and trying to do the best we can to prioritize, but recognize that it's going to change. It's going to change dramatically sometimes. And the other part of the language that's really important is expended by in the discretion of the Board of Education, particularly because you're a regional board. I mean, if you were Orange, Bethany, or Woodbridge, you do have a finance structure, a finance board that does have some oversight, more oversight over their budget than they do yours. Do they actually react to your budget in any way or vote on anything to support or not, or it's out of the?
So we have a unique finance committee where one member from each of the town finance committees sit on our board's finance committee. So it's 3 and 3. So they do have input and will often give suggestions for what they feel they could support in our budget.
It's probably very helpful.
Yeah.
I hope, yeah. Usually. So yeah,
it
but
at least keeps lines of communication open.
absolutely, absolutely, very important. And I can recall a situation, was it 15, 20 years ago, where there was a finance issue and the towns had lost confidence. And so there was a healing process to go through to get back to getting that confidence, because you need their support. The other part, again, is you make the decisions. And again, because of the structure, there's less influence from the boards of selectmen of the sending towns, but ultimately you do have to make the decisions you think are best. You are allowed to transfer money. And again, my first year as a board member, the superintendent, back at May, toward the end of the year, we can take some of this money that we didn't spend here and we can do it here. And of course, you can't do that. It's a budget, and you put it in the budget, you can't change it. Well, it's not a budget, and yes, you can. So it's helpful, especially for new board members in your first budget year, to understand that that's part of the process. And then finally, and I want to spend a couple minutes, we've talked about some of the issues already. If the board is working within its statutory authority, so you make a decision that you have the legal authority to make, it doesn't mean there won't be a lawsuit. It doesn't mean that the district may lose a lawsuit, but it does mean that you will be personally not responsible financially for what happens. Excuse me. So in other words, well, let's take it. So it's within your authority, and the act is not considered wanton, reckless, or malicious. So if the board made a decision, I can remember a district a number of years ago, a teacher was accused of doing something very inappropriate with a student. The board, before the superintendent had completed an investigation, the board terminated that person. And we fast forward 20 years. His career was shot, by the way. He had a nervous breakdown. I heard through the grapevine what had happened to this gentleman over the years. And of course, very little sympathy at first, but then you find out 20 years later, the student came up 20 years later and recanted and said it really never happened. I was going through problems, took it out on him. And the school district, because there was, I guess, at least reckless, because they did not allow the proper investigation, there was a fairly hefty financial restitution made. It's sealed, a lot of those things are sealed, but it was, I heard, pretty decent 6-figure number. You want to make sure, and that's where your board attorney comes in. If you're skirting with something that has legal issues around it, you're either talking to your board attorney. If it's still in an infancy, you might want to save the phone call to them. We have attorneys on staff that are really good on school law in a lot of areas. Many times, especially with board members, we can answer the question without going through that whole process. Although if it's something that, if it's labor related and it's starting into the process, we would turn back and say, we're not here to represent you or give you legal guidance when it is in process. That's when you really have to go back to your board attorney, but listen to them, pay attention to them. And I have seen boards that say, I don't really like the attorney's recommendation. We're going to do something different. You're asking for trouble. If you reach a point at some point as a board that you lose confidence in an attorney, start looking for a new one. But while that person is your attorney, you better pay attention because they're going to keep you from getting hurt. I have seen board members, going back to my friend, Mr. Smith, was it, who made the comment about the teacher. If you made those negative comments and it did impact that teacher's termination, for example, or it came out afterwards. I'll give you an example. We had a principal, and this was a RIF. This was just reduction in force because of budget. We eliminated one of 3 vice principals at our high school. And the union played some games. This particular principal was out sick. He had been injured, and the union filed a grievance, and they chose a different person to be this third person to be terminated, even though he wasn't last hired, and the rule was supposed to be last hired, first fired. But they negotiated it in a grievance. That principal sued because not only couldn't he lost his job, but then because the district got very bad legal advice, we refused to give him a letter of recommendation because he had set up his due process rights. He sued the district to get his job back. And our attorney said, well, if he actually wasn't an attorney, he taught education law, but he wasn't actually an attorney. But his advice was, as long as we are in a legal process with him, we can't give him a letter of recommendation. Well, for that reason, he was driving a school bus 5 years later. This was a guy that was a good principal. So here's where it got even more complicated. 2 things happened. One, the 3rd or 4th level of appeal, the judge said, oh, it seems like he got his 30-day notice on the 31st day. He's going to get his job back and he's going to get back pay. And because here's the other part of the kicker, and this is why I'm bringing this up. The word was out there that the board chair was going around town saying the real reason he was the one that got fired is because he's a drunk. And they heard that. The lawyer and the principal heard that. And so now they're coming to the board and saying, do you really want a bloodbath? Because we're either going to settle this and get it done, or the roof's going to blow off. Now, I will say our board chair was a very brilliant attorney. I cannot believe that she actually would have said that. But that added pressure, whether she did or not, of having this scattered all over the newspapers, they gave the guy his job back. He got a significant, he got all his back pay and a sort of damages payment. And wouldn't you know it, he actually was a drunk. And for 5 years that he stayed working, they finally put him in an office in the high school, gave him special projects to do, and he didn't do anything for 5 years. And the reason the drunk part was, I happened to be talking to my daughter and one of her friends years later. My daughter was in her 20s or 30s when this conversation took place. You remember Mr. So-and-so? Oh yeah. He always kept a bottle of vodka in his desk drawer. The kids knew it. So again, But if you are, as a board, embroiled in any of this noise, it is going to impact what happens as a district. I know I'm sort of overdoing some of this, but I would rather you be a little bit scared and conscious of what can happen. Or a board member that's told something in executive session. Again, something that actually happened. And there's some other advice that this helps you with, I think, when it comes to you and your superintendent. The superintendent came to the board in executive session at the end of a board meeting and said, we have a teacher, Mr. So-and-so, who has been accused of doing some very improper things. I am starting an investigation. Now, when a superintendent starts an investigation, the first thing they're not going to do is tell the teacher, by the way, I've heard some bad things about you. I'm investigating you. They are going to see what they can find out before the person even knows they're being investigated. At some point, you invoke due process and things start to happen. This board member happened to go to the PTO meeting at that school the very next night. He was conscious of who it was. He had a lot of friends in that PTO. He said, by the way, folks, I need to warn you, Mr. So-and-so has been accused of doing such and such. Be careful. He got sued and he had damages. I don't know what they were because that was, again, sealed records, but he was held personally liable because, wanton, reckless, malicious. I'm not sure exactly where that would fall, but it was outside of his purview to warn people about things he had heard in executive session. Second, it made it harder for the superintendent to, in fact, do an investigation because it's all out there. It was chaos. It was absolute chaos. Now, this is where I want to also stress that if your superintendent comes to you with, I'm dealing with the situation, I don't want to give you too much information because you may be the hearing board. If it results in a termination, I need you to be a board of education, not a bunch of people that have to recuse yourself. But I'm going, there's enough information so that if it showed up in the newspaper or on Facebook tomorrow, you're not shocked. But at the same time, you need to have the confidence in your superintendent to say, if someone says something to you, or you get a phone call, or it's in the paper, or it's on Facebook, the superintendent's aware of it, she's taking care of it. I'm really not at liberty to discuss it anymore. And to the point even of, we are not privy to that information because it's a personnel matter, and that's an administrative decision at this point. We have to be clear so that if it does become a board issue, we can act on it as a Board of Education and not be part of the problem. So your superintendent may come to you from time to time, sometimes even code, we have a problem, it involves somebody, and, try to talk around it enough to give you information so that you don't feel the need to continue to investigate it or give too much information out to a parent if they call you. So really critical that you don't put too many demands on your superintendent when you get information like that. She will give you what you need to know as it becomes important. And at some point it may become a hearing of the board or whatever. And at that point you need to, be free of that. And those things will also help you when it comes to personal liability. The only other two places in law that you might personally be held responsible if you deliberately violate freedom of information. There have been a couple occasions where board members were personally held responsible for a violation and had to be fined individually. In the case I'm very familiar with, it was a board decision to do something, so every board member was charged like a $250 fine for a decision they'd made on release of some documents or something. But that was after 3 or 4 attempts. They were kicked back from the commission 3 or 4 times. You have to do it. You have to do it. You have to do it. And they kept saying no. So the commission finally said, you're not getting the message. Everybody's paying a fine. So you have to really, the commission's not there to punish people who make honest mistakes. If you made a motion and voted in executive session, for example, forgetting that we have to go back into public session, technically you violated the law. Technically that vote is not valid. But if the commission says it was 11 o'clock at night, you were tired, you made a mistake, at your next board meeting, put it back on the agenda, vote on it again. And that's their idea for resolution. They're not looking to punish people for honest mistakes. If they're deliberate, however, different story. And there are times when they will rule against the board if you did something wrong. The other one is if you deliberately overspend your budget not an inconsequential thing. You could be held, I say could be held personally responsible for the overage. Now, deliberately is an important word there. If you got a report that says we are at zero but we've zeroed out the budget, we are not, or our itemized estimate. I really have to keep forcing myself to say that too. But we didn't have a deficit. We didn't have a surplus. We are perfect. We came in just right. And then one of you says, well, that's great news. I was at the football game Sunday. I noticed that, or Saturday, I noticed the band has really terrible uniforms. They really need to be redone. I moved that we pay $50,000 for new band uniforms. That could be considered deliberately overspending. I suspect that would be a great test case for somebody to sue, because that's different than, a boiler died, or we finally got our special ed invoices in from the RESC, and or the state finally reimbursed us for the excessive cost, and it's far less than we anticipated because they cut the amount that they were supposed to give us. Whatever it might be, that's different. And the state accommodates you as long as you make every attempt to make up the difference, either through additional cuts or getting more money from your finance boards. You are expected to go back to the towns and say, we have a deficit, here's why. We can rationalize it, we can justify it. The expectation of the state would be that the town should do that. Sometimes it's a challenge. I know a couple situations where the commissioner actually would get involved and call for a selectman or a mayor and say, you have to do this. So it's not like you're left out in the cold, but that it is in statute, although the good news is it has never been enacted. No one has ever had to do that. But it's nice to know that. There's been a couple towns, like one of the elementary districts sent their kids to one of the endowed academies. At Winchester sent their kids to Gilbert School, which is a private school that takes tuition students. The town had given them a zero increase for 5 or 7 years in a row, and they had reached a point where they could no longer afford to pay the high school. And in December, they ran out of money. And the school said, if we don't get the money, we close the doors. And that's kind of actually the expectation that the state would have. Now, the state helped negotiate a compromise, and actually the state kicked in additional resources to help them because it wasn't their fault. But they also gave them a receiver who put the superintendent on leave and ran the district for 2 years to help them get through those difficult times. And the interesting thing is the reason they had so many problems wasn't because the board was doing something wrong. The town finance manager was stealing money for 20 years and no one had ever caught him. And so all these deficits were assumed to be the board's fault, and they actually were the town's fault. They think he stole somewhere between $11 and $20 million, but they have no idea. So yeah. You hear some interesting things. So anyway, in general, I want you to feel comfortable knowing that you're protected. And even in some cases where there is a lawsuit, your district carries insurance to help protect you individually. But if the insurance company is not going to pay if you deliberately broke the law, I mean, they're looking for the clause that says, oh, you violated the law. We don't insure people. It's like you drove off a cliff. We're not paying for your car to get fixed. That's for accidents or for unforeseen issues. I wouldn't want to be the test case with something like that. So now I've thrown a whole lot at you. Reactions, something I may have missed, something you want elaborated on a little bit more. How can I use the rest of our time together to help you out?
Nick, do you want to stop your share and then we'll see more faces?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Excellent idea. Thank you.
Nick, I have a question.
Yes.
So I'm new to the budget process. Can you describe how the board works together with the superintendent to develop that itemized estimate?
Well, your district, they're all a little bit different, but typically the superintendent works with staff and presents a draft budget to the board. You may, I'm going to guess you have a finance committee. Most boards do, and a regional board, I would think you would have to. But it's either, well, actually you said you have the committee with the 3 town finance people and the board members. I'm assuming that serves like a finance committee. So they would review that document, start to look at, starting with what's the percentage. I mean, the finance people are going to basically be saying 4.5%, 6%, whatever it might be, they're going to, while they're going to be interested in how that's divided up, they're going to be really focusing probably on the number. Whereas your finance committee is going, and that's where your staff is going to be explaining the rationale. Our goals are A, B, and C. We've created a budget that aligns with those goals, so they are consistent with our priorities. Let's show you where the new spending is, because there's the continuing spending, which is we had so many teachers at so much a teacher. Those are going to be numbers that we really don't spend a lot of time necessarily debating each time, because unless you have a drop in enrollment or a change, or you're offering something new, you're not talking about new people, you're talking about existing programs. And that typically takes less effort to understand. We're talking about new programs, changes to the system that are going to increase what we spend because we are doing something new. Those are the ones that you're going to probably spend the most time on getting rationalizations. You know, we had to bring in this new math curriculum because our assessments were showing deficits in these particular skills at the third grade, or I'm sorry, not eighth grade, your middle high. And so we were finding too many kids are not passing SATs. So we'd like to do some kind of SAT prep program, for example. That's when the budget committee would, and maybe you have to change that to itemized estimate committee. But you would then sort of review it, working with the superintendent, come up with something that you think is going to be acceptable to the board, and then present it to the board as a whole. And then the board has sort of a similar review process, probably going to include the community in public hearings or surveys or whatever you might do to get community feedback from that. And then the board would vote, because ultimately it's your budget. It starts as the superintendent's budget, but ultimately when you vote to pass it, it becomes your budget. And that means you're responsible for advocating for it, for getting people to support it. I know some board members like, well, I can't go out there and push the budget. I'm a public official, and we have to let the people decide. No, it's your budget. Get out there with signs, vote yes, knock on doors if you have to, write letters to the editor. This is the good we want to do with this. The laws on financing budget deliberations mean the district cannot spend money once there's a date set for a referendum. So the district can't send a flyer out saying, please vote yes. But you could write a letter to the editor saying, I'm a board member, or here's the Board of Education. We've all signed it. We encourage you to support the budget. Here's the good things we're trying to do for the district. So that's a typical way a budget would be formed and processed through. There might be nuances that you do different. Jennifer?
Carol, we are looking, so the two professors who are helping to run the school finance class that I'm in, I'm hoping to secure them for December 5th for another possible special meeting where they can do sort of a half and half presentation on kind of an overview of how school finance works. It'll help address some of the issues Nick already brought up about how special education is funded, excess cost, what happens with minimum budget requirements. And then at the same time, maybe give some tips and pointers on how boards of education can look at the itemized estimate for the school year and ways in which they can help support that. So we're looking at another special meeting that's solely devoted to budget. It'll be very early in the budget season. I just need to kind of finish up the details with them. You'll have heard probably from the department heads, so the principals and like technology and maintenance on their requests, but it'll be well before you get to my budget proposal. So hopefully it will be something very similar to this, but just around finance and budget.
I hope you'll record that, because that sounds like something everybody should hear.
Yeah, it could be good.
In fact, you might consider, it's too late, obviously, for this year's convention, but maybe, doing something where your board puts in a proposal for a workshop at next year's convention with them as part of it to talk about what you do, because that sounds really interesting. And I think people would love to hear something like that. Christina?
I want to thank you for the thoroughness of the information you provided. It's really been helpful. Regarding the budget, what do you do if different members of the board have different feelings on supporting the budget. And I guess I'm trying to understand advocating for or against. It's okay to be divided, and it's okay to kind of interact with the local media as far as your positions. Could you just speak more to that?
I can. And I've grown a lot since I was a board member, because I'll be honest with you, I voted against my first budget way back when. The superintendent, I thought, was a little too casual with the way it happened. And in fact, we had the draft, the budget went to the town council. They reduced it by $150,000, which sounds like nothing, but it was a lot of money 40 years ago almost. And then the superintendent came back to the board and said, "You're not going to believe this, but we just got our bill for our insurance, and it's $150,000 less, so we don't have to cut a thing." But he did that 2 nights before the town council would have finalized the budget. So they went back and cut $300,000 because they were so mad because it looked so fake. And so I felt I can't go to the town and say, I really believe this was the best spending plan we could come up with. And so I did vote against it. Now, I did promise the chair, I said, I did vote against it because we get to vote. I mean, it's not like one person casts a vote for the board. If you have 13 people voting, you can have 13 people voting. But what I did say was, I will not work against it and I will not speak against it. So, I'll be with you when we approach the town council, because we had a joint meeting to discuss it. I'll stand there. I will answer questions honestly, but I'm not going to do it in any way that's going to make the board look bad. I'll just say I thought we had different priorities that would have helped. We hoped we could have addressed better. Ultimately, I think it goes back to that very first thing we talked about after the Constitution. The job is to provide good schools, and we can approach it from a variety of ways. And I know some people come on a board of education. I'm the finance person. The only reason I'm here is for budget.
What do you want to do?
So I think it's important, though, that we have
You want some piece of chicken?
there. Thanks, Paul. Threw me for a second. I'd like some chicken. So Sean wants some too. So where were we? Get me back on track, because I got sidetracked there for a
I'm
second.
talking about ways you can support the budget, I
Yes,
think, once it's
yes.
adopted by the board versus sort of how you felt about it when you voted either for or against it.
It will never get better. Understand, if board members are actively trying to undermine the budget, and even if that's why they ran, I'm the budget person. I ran to keep taxes low. That's your obligation is to the state of Connecticut. Your obligation is to implement the educational interests of the state. Now, we can feel that we could distribute those resources differently. We could, and ultimately you don't really get to decide. Well, actually, in your board, you do get to decide that final percentage increase, unlike the local towns where they give you something. But you will be balancing it against what you believe the willingness of the towns are to pay. So there's a balancing act, but I caution people that if you are there only for that reason, you are not going to be helping the children in the community. I encourage people, no matter how you vote, no matter how you feel, I think you need to be honest. And I would even go as far to say that if someone says, why didn't you support the budget? Well, I'll explain to you my rationale, but I would hope that when you do that, you're not doing it, and I was probably very guilty of this my first year. I can't believe what those clowns did. Can you believe it? I had to vote no. That was not good boardsmanship. And I learned quickly I better keep my mouth shut. My job is to vote, but then it's to support. Interesting thing about boards of education, you actually serve in all 3 forms of government. You are the legislative branch, you pass policies which have the effect of law. You are the legislative branch, or the judicial branch. You have formal hearings where you make judicial decisions. You render decisions that have impact on people's careers and livelihoods. And you are also the executive branch. Now, you delegate a lot of that to your superintendent, but it's your budget. It is, so you are responsible as a group for seeing that your budget is passed and implemented. So if you are against it, then in essence, you are not serving in your executive role as a board member. that's not too theoretical, but the fact is though, some people are going to take it too far. I think it's, if the rest of the board can be supportive of it and help offset some of that. I mean, I don't know one board chair that was stood out in front of the polling place with the vote no sign. I mean, you can't do more damage than that. The 2 weeks later, the board voted to remove him as chair. I will say that, but the budget had gotten shot down in the meantime. So there was this crisis in that district. So I saw a couple hands, Sean, Jenny, Carla. I think that's the order I saw the hands. So Sean first, Jenny, then Carla.
Yeah, so just again, while we're on the subject of budget, is it under the board purview to make line item cuts to the budget? There was some debate about that if I remember correctly, in some of our meetings during the budget season.
I'm not a big fan of it, because I think I would rather go back to the superintendent and say, we'll give you the amount, you come back to us and help us understand where best to do it. Ultimately, the board has to make that decision. But I personally, and again, learning, because the worst board meeting we had every year was ads and cuts night. So I can't say we didn't do it. And that's where we were, like one of my board members had just gotten on the board. The only reason he got on the board was he had accepted an appointment to fill a vacancy. He's the only reason I agreed to go on the board was because I wanted middle school soccer. And on ads and cuts night, the year we had a 10% budget cut, that got cut. And he was like, well, that's the only reason I got on the board, was to have, well, sorry, I hope you're going to stick around and be a better board member than that. And he was actually, he turned into a great board member. So you have the ability to do that. But I think if you have a process that avoids it and does it either through the committee or going back to the superintendent and saying, please make the recommendations on where to prioritize, I'm more comfortable with that than, but again, legally, there might be some nuances in the fact that you have your regional budget. And I don't know if there's any restrictions through the contracts or whatever, or the legal papers that drew up the district. But in general, I just think it's better to let your CEO make those, minute decisions. So yes, but maybe not. Sorry, I didn't answer it in a way that probably is clearer.
No, I mean, right at the end there was kind of what I was looking for. Yes, but maybe not the best option. Like I said, back when there was just some confusion during budget season, and to hear it from a different, was great. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Let's see. I think we said Carla then Jenny, or was it Jenny then Carla? You switched in my screen, so I can't remember who's who.
I don't actually have a question. I think I was just moving.
Oh,
Thank
okay.
you.
And I think you cleared up my question when we were talking about supporting the budget. And I was thinking about when I first started, I can't remember who it was, but someone told me that once the board takes action and makes a vote, it becomes the will of the board. So even if it's not something that you agreed on and you voted no, ethically, it's important not to work against the board.
Yes.
That you can explain why you don't support whatever it was that we were voting on, but to actively work against it is not really
It's
in the
horrible.
best interest.
And I, even ethically, I have a problem with it. Are you allowed to by law? Yes. Is it good practice? Absolutely not. And again, it builds resentment. If you're planning on serving on the board for a while and you're doing things like that, you're going to lose the confidence of your colleagues. And ultimately, you may want to do things yourself and they're not going to support them, and I'd hate to have people not support something I want to do because of how I behave rather than what I'm proposing. And unfortunately, if we are negative in our approach, then often that's how we're perceived by our colleagues. Christina, did you have your hand up? You. There you go.
I guess I'm struggling with, if you have a different viewpoint, that it's a negative thing. So I appreciate this ability to engage in a conversation about a difference in thought. Obviously, these are complicated topics.
Yeah.
So no, but I didn't have my hand up, but thank you for.
Well, there's definitely a difference between And in fact, I'm a very strong, the board I served on for the first 2 years was 5-2 politically, and I was one of the two. I got one thing passed in 2 years, one motion that I made passed in 2 years, and I voted against it. So this is the toxicity that we had on our board. And we disagreed on everything. Now, when I first started, I had a lot of learning to do. I didn't know how to play in the sandbox nicely with other people. And I misbehaved a lot. Now, part of it was my fault for not behaving, but part of it I'm going to lay on the majority board members, because the chair would look at me with my hand raised and go, "We don't need to hear from you." Now, if there's a motion and I vote no, if I had an opportunity to say, I'm going to vote no because, I would have been perfectly content with that. But the fact that on a couple very serious issues, nobody even knew why I voted no, I felt it was important to explain why. So I actually wrote a letter to the editor of the Hartford Courant one time. It was so contentious an issue, they made it an op-ed. So I had the whole bottom of the op-ed of the editorial page, and it hit the fan. I mean, although it was interesting because a lot of the people who were politically opposed to me called me and congratulated me because somebody had the guts to stand up. But I think the difference is, and the way I would put it, when there's a conflict in terms of disagreement, if everybody's had the opportunity to share their thoughts and to really participate in the process, then I think most people are willing to then accept the outcome. If I gave it my all, if I shared my concerns, especially if I felt that people were listening, and maybe you still passed it, but you modified it slightly so that it makes it less odious to me, I'm much more likely to stand behind it afterwards. I still may vote no, and you always have that right. But I think there's a difference of being part of the process, and I absolutely agree. Why otherwise elect one? You don't even need a board if it's supposed to be automatic. That you have a right, and that's, you're bringing perspectives from 3 different towns. How could you not have some issues occasionally that might be different impact, especially given that slide where we saw the size? There's some very different sizes in those districts. You're going to have different needs and different challenges.
I mean, Nick, if I'm hearing it's okay for our board to pass something 7-6 or fail something 7-6, but I guess once it happens, it's not so much that you necessarily support the decision, but you don't actively act against the decision.
Right.
Is that a way to summarize
Yes,
that?
I honor the decision of the board, and I'm a member of the board. I will support the board in their decision. Absolutely. I think that's a fair expectation. And as I say, if people have felt part of the process, win or lose, they're much more likely to accept that. It's when you feel you're excluded, or you walk into a board meeting, it seems like 6 people already know what they're going to do, and I haven't even heard what the proposal is yet. That's when I'm going to start pushing back a little bit, or I would expect that. But I think the folks in a majority of a vote have every bit of a responsibility to ensure the voices are heard from everybody. You know, we all have a say in this, and the more collaborative you are as a board, the more likely, and I would suspect that if you're a very collaborative board, there's going to be it's rare that you'd have a 7-6 vote, that it's going to be more even. The only place I will say this is where I think board members should consider at least voting for something when you're against it, is in terms of like hiring. I worked with the board recently, and actually I had to come in and talk to the board because I think it was like a 5-4 split on hiring a new superintendent. And the consultant even said to them, and in fact, I do a workshop for superintendents periodically called Mistakes Superintendents Make. And number 1 is take the job on a split vote. I always caution superintendents, especially if the board chair is one of the people that voted against you, you are doomed. But that's one place that, you know, usually a lot of this conversation is executive session, and you'll know if somebody's really opposed. But understand that you run the risk of not getting somebody, because I know some candidates who will say, if it's a 5-4 vote, I'm not taking the job. We're doomed right from the start. Or that if the word gets out, and it will, because when you vote, that's in public, any initiative your superintendent's going to bring to the staff from the board is immediately, the staff are going to be split on it typically, and they're going to say, well, we don't have to do anything because the board split half and half, you know, pretty much 50 or 51-49%. that superintendent's not going to be around much longer. We don't have to worry about these new initiatives. So we don't have to really pay attention. And this is not something made up. This happens regularly. So I think that's a place where I would encourage amongst yourselves, have the conversations, share with your colleagues your concerns. But when it comes down to it, at least consider saying, in the interest of unity for our new candidate, I will vote yes. That's really one of the only places where I think it's important to do that, or at least to be considered doing that. That one board, actually there were 11 board members and they were afraid it was going to be 6-5. It ended up being 10-1 because we had a really good conversation. And the board members said, you know what, that's not fair. And their concerns weren't about the performance of this particular candidate. I'm not even sure what it was, but it was more personality driven. They said, we're not going to set that person up for failure. We're just not going to do that. So that's a place, but always vote your conscience. Always, if no feels right, vote no. But it's that active undermining afterwards that I think is where you want to be careful not to do it if you can. I'm looking around. Paul, are you with us?
I am with you, and I want to apologize for not inviting you off the chicken.
Oh, I'm hungry now.
I actually had an opportunity to listen to most of this evening's presentation. I also want to apologize for not having the ability to take part. I want to thank you. You've done a great job.
Thank you.
I found that in many ways, I felt this board comes out to be a very, very positive board. We've all, since I've only been there for 3 years also, and acted as chair only for the last few months, but in all cases, I found that we're respectful of each other. We listen to each other. We do have disagreements, but in general, they're based on policy, personal, opinions, and so on. And politically, in the years that I've been on the board, the 3 years, I don't think I've ever even heard the word Republican or Democrat mentioned by a board member. I know that some board members aren't even aware of what party some of the other members are. So it's for us, it's not political. I do want to ask you one particular question. One of our issues has been communication with the public, and we're working on a communication committee. Generally, though, our policy is that the board chair speaks for the board. Now, if we get into situations where we have differences of opinion and each individual board member is going to start going out and contacting the media, how does our credibility as a board going to be impacted? And is that something that can be done? I always got the impression that it was, the state basically gave the chair the position of being spokesman for the board.
Well, actually, the statute just says the chair can call meetings.
Okay.
Any
Right.
other authority given to a chair is done basically through bylaws or policy or just
Mhm.
good practice. I mean, chairs, expectations of chairs are pretty similar around the state. Some, like I said, get served by the papers, from the sheriff. But in general, there's some things you might have to sign, but other than actually chairing meetings, there's really no state expectations, but you all have them. Your policy may say the chair appoints committees, for example, or some boards approve committees. So there's some varieties there, but it is good practice for the chair to act as spokesperson for the board. It is good practice for the superintendent to also be a spokesperson for the district when necessary. And particularly when it's a challenging issue. Again, teacher arrested for something nefarious. The superintendent called me. I was board chair at that time. It said, we've had this issue. I'm sitting down with the board's attorney tomorrow at 9. Could you come in? Because the two of us he's going to prep us on what we should or shouldn't say. which was incredibly helpful because this person, he ended up going to prison for 8 years, as he should have. But imagine again, if we did something wrong, or if one of our board members said something inappropriate or just wrong, the complexities that could have caused. So we immediately sent an email out to the rest of the board members. We've had a situation, Nick and Paul are going to meet with the attorney. We're going to be given advice on what we should or shouldn't say. And we caution every other board member to just refer back to us. And it was such a difficult issue. Everybody was more than happy. No, call Nick, call Paul. We don't want to touch it. And we managed to get through that okay. But it's good practice. Now, do you have First Amendment rights? Yes. People are able to speak, and sometimes they're contrary. But again, there's a thing called like a duty of responsibility when you serve on a board, whether it's a corporate board, a nonprofit board, a board of education, that you have some obligation to the entity that you are a member of. You swear an oath to uphold the work of the board, when you first come on the board. So there's an expectation that I am here as a member of this board and an active participant of it. And so I think that gives you some obligations that are probably more ethical than legal. You can do some things that probably aren't very nice or appropriate, but you have the right to do them. But again, if you are trying to foster, as you say, if you don't even know who some of the people's political parties after a couple, 3 years, you're doing a pretty darn good job of not doing that, because that's often what triggers something like this. It could be politics, or somebody has a bone to pick or something. But it's good practice. And I think having some sort of communications policy is a very good idea. Articulating if there's an issue, it should go through the chair or the superintendent. Board members should make references to others. Whether you also include something about how staff communicate or how we use social media, a lot of that's starting to show up in board policies, what's appropriate. And again, people have a right, but sometimes your right to be on Facebook means that you might say something that causes the harm to the district somewhere down the line. So, and social media has exacerbated all the tension because it's immediate. One little tidbit of advice, and again, going back to the dark ages before cell phones, even that we didn't even, I had a beeper. I was a plumbing contractor when I was a school board member, and I had a beeper, and I still had to go around finding a payphone everywhere because they still had those. But in those days, let's say a kindergartner fell asleep on the bus and the driver parked the bus and went home. It's very serious, but the principal gets a phone call. If it happened at 3 o'clock, the principal gets a call at 3:30. We got the kid's home, everybody's okay. Principal would call the superintendent at 3:30 and say, look, we had a situation, kid's okay, everything's fine. Superintendent, because it's Friday afternoon, would say, look, come up to the office on Monday, or I'll come down and see you on Monday. We'll talk about it, figure out what happened and what we should do about it. Monday, have the meeting, fire the bus driver or whatever they're going to do. Reporter doesn't even know about it yet. He calls on Monday afternoon, or she calls on Monday afternoon and says, hey, I heard you had an incident on a school bus. Now, as a board member, my expectation was, we heard about a problem. There was a careful, thoughtful investigation followed by a thoughtful database decision by our administration, and that everything's okay. So when the reporter calls and the superintendent says, yes, we had a situation, there was a kid left on the bus, driver's been fired, everything's done. Your expectation is, I didn't read about it in the newspaper. That's how I didn't learn about it. Everything got resolved properly. Now with social media, if it happened at 3 o'clock, at 3:01, the whole world knows about it. And it wasn't just that a kid fell asleep on the bus in the bus yard. The kid fell asleep when the bus was going off the cliff after it exploded. And so there's that whole message line where it just gets worse and worse and worse. And so I think the internet, if it's done one thing, has made our expectations immediate. I want resolution now. I don't want to wait till Monday, or the people that are calling out to me aren't going to be satisfied with waiting till Monday. But as a board member, I still want that same expectation. I want my superintendent to do a careful, thoughtful investigation and make a decision based on the facts that are in the best interest of the children and the district. That isn't going to happen on Friday afternoon. And so our message to our community has to be a little different. When they call and say, I'm really upset, I just heard that this is happening, or they're going to stop, they're going to shut down the football field and we're not going to have football at the high school anymore. Well, I'm not going to overreact. I think we start with, well, let me make a phone call and let's see what's going on. I think if there's, and here's again, part of the dilemma. I know your superintendent has a chain, like a phone chain. If there's a real crisis, you're going to get the word, whether it's to call the chair and the chair disperses it, or whether you get a call from central office, however it is, or email. If there's a crisis, you're going to hear about it. Now, here's the problem. Sometimes you might perceive it as a crisis. She might not. 9 of you might not perceive it as a crisis. Only a couple of you might. But the superintendent's got to do the best she can to assess and then determine this rises to the level of the board knowing about it right away or not. Sometimes she's going to get it wrong just because as she gets more information, oh, well, that's not what I heard, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got to have patience, and your message to the people that are calling out to you has to be, and even better, yes, we're aware there was a situation, the superintendent's looking at it. They're going to have a meeting, they're going to discuss it. We'll announce a resolution when it happens. And whether people are happy with that or not, they have to accept that we are not going to make a snap decision. We are not, I don't want my superintendent making a bad decision because she's under pressure from us. I don't want to be responsible for her rushing something. I want her to do what she's got to do.
Thank you for that, but I have, if you don't mind, one more question that comes up.
Sure.
As board members, we of course have students in the school district, or for the most part, and every day something happens in the school district, something that maybe we think the superintendent should be aware of. The kids bring it home. We heard about it from another parent who gives us a call and said, "Would you believe this happened?" We see it on social media. What is our responsibility or obligation to inform the superintendent, the principal, or so on, because we're hearing it as a board member of a particular incident? And on the other side of the coin, we may hear it and say, "Oh, come on, that can't possibly have happened."
That's a great question. And I can go back to when I was a member. There were times when I'd call the superintendent, and I wasn't to find out what she was going to do about it. It was just, and this was again, before we were flooded with social media. But if I heard something that was disturbing, I would at least let the superintendent know, I've been hearing this. I don't have a clue as to how accurate it is, but you probably need to know it. She probably already does, but she might not. And then I'd step back. I don't expect to immediately have her try to solve the problem, even if it's my problem, or if it's another parent's, a friend's problem. I just want you to know that this is going on, or this is being said, so that you won't be surprised either. Because I don't, just like you as a board member don't want to be blindsided, I don't want my superintendent blindsided by something. Jennifer, do you have any follow-up to that? Is there something you'd like board members to do if that happens?
So sort of a little bit of twofold. I think the most important thing that board members can do, because this is what we see, is parents will fire off on social media, but they never contacted the school to begin with. So redirecting parents back to contacting the school is super helpful, because like doing that, like just saying stuff on social media and not telling anyone at the school isn't going to help them either. So that is helpful. And then, yeah, it is kind of nice, you know, I mean, clearly I have my enchant. I don't follow social media at all. I think people think that I am on Facebook. I am not. I stay miles away from it and Twitter, but I have people who tell me what's out there, and I oftentimes do hear about it ahead of time. It helps to prep for what's coming. But I also take it with a grain of salt. Because again, like you said, it's a little bit embellished at times. And frankly, whatever's out there, it doesn't matter what I do. I can't fight the message that's going through on social media anyway. So, you know, if it's an issue that I think is going to come, honestly, I use it most frequently when I think there's going to be something coming to a board meeting. I will usually ask people, what's the take on social media, so I can help the board know what's coming to them. But if it's something in the school, I usually can't change the court of public opinion. I can just keep doing the right thing based on what we know of the situation. But the biggest thing is redirecting people, because they say things on social media and they never tell us at all, and we can't help them.
I had a parent call me one time, and actually 3 parents in 3 years, same teacher. It got a little disconcerting, and I think now I'd do it differently. But back then, parent called, my daughter came home from school today very uncomfortable because she thought her science teacher was doing something inappropriate. Nothing overt, but just behavior-wise, very uncomfortable. I said, call a principal. You know, well, I am not sure I should do that. No, please call a principal. I'll give you his home phone number. I know he loves his kids and he would do anything for them. He will respond to you immediately. Please call him. Well, no, you know, maybe she imagined it. I don't want to get anybody in trouble. Can't you just fire him? Those were her words. Well, yeah, no, we can't just fire him. You have to file a complaint. Please do. But I have to explain to you that I'm not a first reporter. For this to go further, because I'm a board member and I may have to deal with this later, for this to go further than tonight, this phone call, you have to call the principal. Never happened. A year later, second parent, same teacher, similar situation. So now I'm like, okay, please call the principal. But I then did call the superintendent and say, you know, I'm not sure what's going on here, but this is the second time I've heard of this. You should look at it. And then my daughter came home the next year and had him for her teacher. And I said, I don't want to put any thoughts in your head. I don't want to create a problem that isn't there, but I've heard some things about this guy. Just if something happens, please let me know. That's all I want to know. If something happens, let me know. She goes, well, yeah, my friend said she did think he was trying to look down her blouse today. And so immediately like, oh, my God. So I, again, called the superintendent and I was I said, look, you have to do what you do. And I realize that people are innocent until proven guilty. But I have to tell you that if something like this happens to my daughter, I'm going to go visit the man in his classroom with a shotgun. And well, you know, I said, no, to be fair, he may be innocent, so I won't load it the first time. But as a parent, because Paul, to your point too, if we're a parent, we never stop being a parent. And there is that role of, I'm a board member. In fact, I would have my wife respond to the principals or the teachers where possible, so that I didn't put undue pressure on the teacher or the principal, because they're seeing board member. And I'm like, I'm only here as a parent, but they're seeing board member. So it was a challenge. But, and in this case, I mentioned that one of our teachers got arrested. Well, when he got arrested and the police were investigating him, this other teacher, his name came up several times and the police did investigate him. And out of all that, they brought in psychologists. I mean, they really did a number trying to figure out what this guy had done or not done. And I don't know the process. It's not my place to know all the nuances, but they basically came back and said he was never given appropriate professional development in how to interact with adolescent females. I don't know what that means, but they gave him professional development. He did not get fired. And there was never an incident in that school again. He lasted another 10 years, I think. There was never another problem. But going back to that other district where they fired a teacher when it was just assumptions or innuendo or even accusations, but not verified, if we had fired him, we could have opened ourselves up. So that's why we had to let the superintendent deal with it, with his administration, with the experts he brought in. It was his and the police, because the police were actively investigating this as well. So it was not the board's place to do that, but we had to make sure the superintendent had the resources and the support of us. He had to know that when this happened, we got your back. You know, if you're doing what you need to do, we're going to be there to support you through this, because when it's that public, you are worried about the superintendent getting in the crosshairs too.
Thank you.
Sean.
Completely off topic from what we were just talking about, but a couple of things made me think of it. We have had collectively during public comment, people have brought up, we come up to the microphone, we express our opinions, and then it seems like you guys never talk about it. Is there something I could do or a fellow board member can do as a single board member to get the ball rolling on those? What's the proper course of action to get the ball rolling on that? And what's appropriate, what isn't?
Well, as far as during that meeting, when they're saying what they're saying, is it's really not appropriate to follow up on that in any way.
Right.
Now, what a lot of boards do now, and I can provide, I'll make a note to do it. I can provide a couple samples at the beginning of public comment. In fact, in a couple cases, at the beginning of the board meeting, there's a little statement they read. This is a meeting of the Board of Education where we make policy decisions, based as our legal obligation to be an education, support the educational interests of the state. I mean, so they lay out a little bit at the beginning of the meeting. This is our role. We're not here to solve your individual problem tonight. And then you talk about public comment. Public comment is an opportunity to share your thoughts and ideas. As a matter of course, we do not respond this evening, but please understand that somebody's paying attention. Many of the, in fact, they're usually an admonition. If you have a problem with an individual teacher or school, please go back to the school and deal with the administration there. And if there needs resolution, talk to the superintendent. And usually the superintendent's taking notes, or, call me tomorrow or something. There's little messaging going on, but you lay out ahead of time what they can expect. Because I think some of it is, I spoke for 5 minutes and 3 minutes is a good limit. You have the right to limit. We'll talk about that in a second. I don't want to lose the chain of thought, but to give a description of what they can expect up front, and that if there's a need for follow-up, it will happen later. That's, I think, the first thing. The other thing is to understand public comment is not a legal right. It is a privilege that you give the public. The law says you must do business in public. It does not say the public is part of your business. So you are giving a privilege to people to address the Board of Education. Now, I don't take that lightly. And if you don't do it, you're going to have big problems, because there, in fact, one town dropped public participation and the ACLU got involved in a lawsuit. But you have the right to put legitimate restrictions on it, like time limits. You can say the first 15 minutes of a board meeting and then submit in writing, or just want to click that off. So again, we could, and I know I just got a note, it's 8:18 and we said 8. I can go all night, but I know you have things to do, and your superintendent has a busy day tomorrow, I'm sure. But in general, I'd say a lot of it can be resolved by starting that session by saying, and I'll provide a copy of what that looks like, people, what you can expect from public comment, that, which may be very helpful.
Right.
Beyond that,
I'm sorry. Only other part, we definitely do that. I know our chairman definitely lays out all the ground rules. It just, to me, it seems that there's a lot of the same things brought up time and time again. And I know, Jen, you could definitely agree with me on this, that, some of the things that are very important to the public, I know personally that they go to policy, and that's where it needs to be solved. I don't necessarily see or talk to those people. And I think somehow, some way, those people need to know. Like, is there any suggestions on how the board can?
I think it's okay. Well, two things. One, I think it's perfectly fine, while we're not responding to the public comment, to say that we know that's going to the policy committee. So you might want to address your concerns to the policy committee or the chair of the policy committee. So you can direct it. And I think it's okay to, that's not to me responding to the community member with an answer, as much as that's going to policy. So we are working on it. Policy committee's considering it. As a board member, if I heard something 2 or 3 times and I was concerned, is it getting lost? I'd talk to the board chair and say, what are we going to do about this? It's the second or third time I've heard it. The chair may say, I got to be honest with you, I'm not sure it rises to that level or not. Well, the law says 3 board members can request something be put on the agenda. So, or there can be a motion to add something to the agenda, which needs a 2/3 vote to pass. But there are opportunities through procedure. But I would say most often you can solve that just with a phone call to the board chair and say, where is it in our structure that we can actually address this? And it may be just a 5-minute presentation from the superintendent saying, here's what we're doing. I mean, that's often, and if there's a lot of public that's really concerned about a particular issue, don't try to solve it in a public comment period in your regular board meeting. Call a special meeting, have it exclusively for that topic. And I'd even go as far to say, you know, folks, I know a lot of you are here for that tonight. We are going to schedule a special hearing Thursday night. And that's going to be your opportunity to address the board on that. And that does one other important thing. That lets you, the chair, the superintendent, draft a little statement at the beginning of that public hearing saying, we know a lot of people have had concerns about this issue. Before we get started, let me address what we know and what we don't know, you know, so you can probably solve 90% of their anxiety in that statement before you even start. And that helps make the hearing go a little smoother afterwards. Those are a couple strategies.
And I think one of our biggest problems is some of that public comment is against state mandates that you as agents of the state don't have a choice in. And I don't know, I mean, and outside of constantly saying that, and I think that's probably the biggest misunderstanding, is that there are several things that come before us routinely that you are actually responsible for doing because they are the expectations of the State Board of Ed, and you don't really get a choice on that. But there's,
I think that's okay for the chair to say. I mean, I think, you know, look, you're asking the board to violate state law, and we are agents of the state. They are our laws. Whether we like them or don't, we are not going to comment on them, but we are not allowed to do that. We would be in violation of the law.
Well, Nick,
Sorry,
thank you so much. And while I have another second, I just want to thank you again for this. I know I took a ton away from it, and I really thank you for taking the time tonight.
I hope we don't have to wait 4 years to do this again. I've been there since 2004 in one way, shape, or form. I enjoy working with your board. So at any time, if you need anything from me, just all you need to do is call.
all right, Mr. Reed, I think we can turn it to you.
All right, thank you again, Nick. And without any objection, I will adjourn this meeting. We'll see all of you soon.
Okay, have a great night.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
everyone.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Good night now.
Night.